Let's begin with the macro global situation. Brexit trigger is about to happen. I think the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce has talked about the double blow that could hit the Indian economy from a reduction in trade and also the weaker pound sterling. How do you see Brexit over the next couple of years affecting the Indian economy?
Yeah, I think that this is, if Brexit involves Europe and the UK slowing down to some extent, that's going to be bad for our exports. But, I mean, in the short run, at least, the EU economy is doing not badly. You know, Germany is doing reasonably well. The UK is actually on the GDP, it's surprised relative to expectations.
And you've been talking about increased exports from India.
Yeah, so, and that has in fact been reflected in the fact that exports from India, non-oil exports, have really perked up over the last 6 months. I mean, they were in negative territory, volume growth, but now in the last 2 quarters or so, they've come up to about 8-9% non-oil export volume. So, and that's a steady upward trend. So it seems like, at least in the short run, we've survived Brexit reasonably well.
What should be the focus then in seeking any post-2019 trade deal?
Yeah, I think that, I think the Indian government's position is clear that we want to have closer relations with both the UK and the EU. It's a matter of timing how we do it, because I think the whole UK-EU relations have to sort themselves out. So I think we have been in discussions on a free trade agreement with the European Union. Yeah. I mean, there are also discussions with the UK. So essentially, going forward, if we can get closer trade relations with both parties, that's the way forward for us.
How are you reading Donald Trump right now? You've talked about what the big impact that protectionism could have on the domestic Indian economy. How are you reading it so far?
You see, remember, so far, despite all the the campaign rhetoric and the early days, we haven't seen much actual protectionist action. There are all these bills and intentions to act, but nothing has actually happened. So to that extent, I think so far things seem okay. But if there were to be any serious protectionist measures, for example, on the H-1B visas, I think it would have a negative impact on our economy, because I've maintained very strongly that in order to grow at 8 to 10%, which is what we aspire to do, our exports have to grow at about 15% every year, both goods and services. And if you have these protectionist trends, that's going to be affected, whether it's Brexit or any protectionist action in the United States.
You know, it's still early on in his, administration. He has time to do that. It's a big concern for the job market for the Indians in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, and the rhetoric, at least. Sure, the immigration bill or policies have been shelved right now, but it could revive. Yeah,
it could revive, but let's wait and see. So until it happens, I don't think we should get over. I mean, the rhetoric was a bit anxiety-inducing, that's to be fair to say, but unless some actual action is taken, I think. And also, I think, if you think about what's been happening, I think the whole system of checks and balances in the US seems to me will kind of work in favor of muting whatever action will be taken by the administration.
Let's talk about the domestic agenda. Lots happening, whether it's GST, whether it's the elections that have just had and the mandate that Mr. Modi has. But first, I want to talk about the investment climate, because while GDP is relatively high, the investment numbers were pretty weak in the fourth quarter. I believe new investment proposals fell in October to December to the lowest in a decade. When we have global rates rising in general, what needs to be done by the Indian government to spur investment?
See, Stephen, first of all, the macroeconomic situation is very stable. Inflation is down, our current account is in very good position, the fiscal deficit is coming down. Yeah. And even in terms of growth, 7% in this environment is not bad at all, especially if you think that we've, emerging from demonetization. It's true what you're saying, that investment in general and private investment in particular have been very weak, but for almost 2 years now. It's not a short-term thing. On the other hand, we've achieved record levels of foreign direct investment. Yeah. So the good foreign money is coming in spades. A lot of it in the service sector, but also in manufacturing. So it's domestic private investment that remains a little bit weak.
Because I've been looking into the numbers. Factory output is fairly weak, job creation fairly weak, but again, you have that relatively high GDP number, the envy of the world. How do you rationalize this dichotomy between the headlines and actually the underlying input numbers?
So essentially in the last couple of years, what's been happening is that, investment has been weak, but consumption has been very strong because oil prices have been down for a long time. So that's, and then public spending has made up for a lot of the private investment. So we have a situation where exports and private investment have been weak, but they've been compensated by consumption and public spending. So that's how broadly the economy has been going. So going forward, I think the big challenge is how do we get private investment back up again? And the number one challenge we face on that is what I call the twin balance sheet problem.
Yes.
It's actually something that Credit Suisse has done a fantastic job, in analyzing the thing. Corporates are over indebted. The public sector banks have a lot of bad loans. So how do we work ourselves out of this? That's the big policy challenge in the months ahead.
And is there a big risk then, too, with the rollout of this nationwide GST, the tax? I was living in Japan in the times when they were trying to stimulate their way out of, kind of malaise, and then they raised their value-added tax, and it basically made everyone stick their money under the kotatsu, into the mattress, right? So what's it going to do to the consumer?
No, see, remember in India, the intention explicitly is that the new rate, the level of the new rate, will be no higher than the level previously. So it's called a revenue neutral rate, and I wrote a report on that as to what the revenue neutral rate. So there's going to be no overall consumption impact because the average level of tax will remain the same. That's point number one. And in some ways, we actually think the tax rate can be lower because the GST is going to give tremendous gains in compliance and efficiency of tax collection. So for any given rate, we will expect to collect much more. I think the question, the concern underlying your question is more implementation.
Yes.
It's a massive tax increase. It's a massive tax change. Administrative change. The center and the states, lots of new procedures, processes, new forms, So there's a huge implementation challenge. There's the IT backbone. And that, I think, but I think that's going to be a temporary thing. In all these things, initially there'll be bumps on the road.
And on top of the demonetization efforts.
Yeah, but I think demonetization, I think we've kind of, I would say that demonetization is mostly behind us because the economy is remonetizing, and we had written that around this time we'll be close to full remonetization.
How should Mr. Modi spend his mandate now after the Uttar Pradesh elections? Big win, nationwide election probably 2019. What should be the priority? Can he move into some reform of state sector, or should he benefit the farmers ahead of that election? What?
Well, I think there are going to be political compulsions versus what I think. I think the most important thing is to get, investment up and growth up. Yeah, and that means that this twin balance sheet problem. So the government is engaging in serious discussions as to what we should do to these bad loans in the banks, how we should resolve some of these bad assets with the corporate sector. So that's the focus of policy attention. So if we can get the GST implemented smoothly, and if we can get this whole twin balance sheet problem solved, and with the world economy actually picking up, growth prospects are may not be too bad.